On this Friday night, amplifying calls for accountability. After finding hundreds of unmarked graves, residential school survivors keep looking for answers.
I was taken from my family when I was 3 years old.
The demands for atonement from the church and the government. What the fully vaccinated can and cannot do. Some guidelines are released, but the messaging is confusing. Derek Chauvin sentenced for murder. The emotional impact statements from George Floyd's family.
If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
The relentless mission to find survivors under a collapsed Florida condo.
We're not giving up at all.
And hockey hangover. Montreal cleans up as the Canadians gear up to bring home the Stanley Cup.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight in Saskatchewan, where a field next to the site of a former residential school is now sacred ground, believed to be the site of at least 600, possibly as many as 751 unmarked graves, the largest discovery of its kind in this country. There was an apology and there were more promises from the Prime Minister today. We'll get to that in just a moment. But we begin by hearing from people from the Cowessess First Nation about what they want. Heather Yourex-West is near that First Nation tonight and has our top story. Heather?
Emotions are so raw here in Saskatchewan. Sadness, but a lot of anger too. This discovery did not come as a shock to the people here, but it has renewed the call for accountability. On the doors of St. Paul Co-Cathedral in downtown Saskatoon, the rage is clear. "We were children," the graffiti reads in blood red paint. Vandalism that took place Thursday on the same day the Cowessess First Nation announced the discovery of as many as 751 people in unmarked graves outside the site of the former Marieval Indian Residential School.
There's a lot of layers to this, and if I might say, this is a long-term process, and anger is legitimate. Anger, and it needs to be heard, and you can't force someone through their anger and all that is with it.
I was taken from my family when I was 3 years old.
Gratia Perkins spent 6 years at the school, her earliest memories filled with abuse. As punishment, she says she was often locked in a dark closet alone.
It was terrifying to be locked in that dark broom closet.
How old were you? For years, she suspected children were buried on the site. Her own cousin was killed in an accident at the school. Discovering the graves, she says, is important for everyone.
Very important. Because I remember looking at those swings in the summertime, in the evening, and it was just calm out, and those swings would always be swinging, just like little kids were playing on there.
But Perkins is looking for accountability and answers from the church as well. The missionary of Oblates of Mary Immaculate ran dozens of residential schools, including the ones on Cowessess First Nation and in Kamloops. It has still not disclosed all of its historical documents. In a statement, it says it has worked to make our historical documents available, but progress has been complicated by issues of provincial and national privacy laws.
Every single document has to be accessible in order to properly identify children, know where they went, because not all graves are going to be known.
Leaving communities to grieve with each new discovery. Members of the Cowessess First Nation plan to gather at the site of the unmarked graves for a community vigil on Saturday night. There is just so much grief here for families, and while there is a need for time and space to heal, there are also a lot of questions that need to be answered too. Donna?
All right, Heather Yourex-West near the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan. Thanks. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canadians are horrified and ashamed that for decades the federal government forcibly removed Indigenous children from their homes and sent them to boarding schools to have their language and culture erased. But strong words and more promises don't change the fact most of the 94 calls to action laid out 6 years ago in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report have not been acted on. Michael Couteur is also looking into accountability tonight.
It is not exactly news for Indigenous peoples.
While the discovery of more graves on the site of a former residential school is devastating,
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says it shouldn't shock people because it was clearly laid out in the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 10 years ago. In 2009, the Harper government denied funding to find graves. More than a decade later, after the discovery in Kamloops, BC, the Liberals said $27 million would be available immediately for that purpose.
Indigenous communities across this country have my commitment that they will get the resources necessary to recover and document as much as possible these kids in these graves.
Unmarked graves account for 5 of the 94 calls to action from the Commission. Some Indigenous leaders feel the lack of progress on all calls to action since the Liberals have been in power is troubling.
Romeo Saganish had it right when he said that the Liberal government doesn't care a damn about Indigenous people and doesn't know anything of substance about what it is that we need.
But that includes an apology from the Pope and more than just an acknowledgement from the Catholic Church, which ran many of the residential schools in Canada.
I think they should be compelled and brought to court even for their role in what happened to our loved ones.
The president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops says the Church is cooperating with supplying documents and in organizing a meeting in Rome between the Pope and Canadian Indigenous leaders.
3 days in Rome. You know, when heads of state only have 15 minutes or half an hour, the Pope has dedicated 1 hour for each one of those Indigenous realities, plus a time for coming together all together, another hour on top of that.
And Donna, the Prime Minister reiterated today any papal apology should take place on Canadian soil.
Mike, I want to ask you about Carolyn Bennett, the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations, who was accused yesterday by her former colleague Jody Wilson-Raybould of sending a racist, demeaning text. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs called it a cowardly attempt to silence a powerful Indigenous voice. They want Bennett to resign. Is the Prime Minister standing by her?
Well, he basically said she's not going anywhere. Prime Minister Trudeau did acknowledge what Minister Bennett did was wrong, and he accepted her apology.
I know Carolyn's heart. I know how hard she has worked for decades on this issue, and I know how much more there is for us all to do. And I know that she understands how much more work she's going to have to do in the coming days, weeks, and months.
And Donna, that's a pretty clear signal he intends to keep Bennett in his cabinet and in this key role.
All right, Mike Couteur, thanks. There is support for those who need it. The Indian Residential School Survivors Crisis Line is available in Canada 24 hours a day. The number is toll-free. You can speak in confidence. The number is 1-866-925-4419. Now, to the pandemic, new federal modeling is warning the highly transmissible Delta variant could make a possible fourth wave worse. It's why there's been such a push to get people vaccinated. More than 76% of eligible Canadians have now received at least one shot. 26% are fully vaccinated. And today, new federal guidelines about what fully vaccinated Canadians are allowed to do were quietly released. Eric Sorensen reports.
We apologize that the tools were not ready.
It was an awkward rollout, but the Public Health Agency of Canada has finally produced guidelines for Canadians depending on their vaccination status. If you are fully vaccinated, you no longer need a mask or to physically distance in most outdoor settings and indoor settings with small groups. You can also consider not having masks or distancing indoors with larger groups or outdoor large gatherings like concerts unless you have health risks. For those not vaccinated or partially vaccinated, no mask or distancing is needed for small groups outside. You could consider mask removal and not distancing for some indoor and outdoor gatherings, but you should still wear a mask and physically distance if you are inside with multiple households or, say, outdoors at a crowded concert.
I think we needed some guidance. I hope that people anticipate that that is going to change over time, and we'll learn as we go. Good to see some guidance, though. People have been looking for it.
So the restrictions are easing for indoor and outdoor gatherings and will be safer the more people get their shots. The urgency now is to have Canadians fully vaccinated. Those older than 60 have a very high uptake of first doses, up to 90% or higher. Under the age of 40, it's still below 70%. Second doses shows a similar pattern. Older Canadians are getting their second shots, but for those under age 30, fewer than 10% have received second doses, and that is a worry. Young adults are more likely to be in work or social gatherings in larger numbers and run the risk of causing a surge in cases this fall or winter, with the highly transmissible Delta variant still spreading.
It does make a difference. They are the highest transmitters because they have an increased social mixing.
The incentives for getting vaccinated by now should be clear.
Almost all the cases, and certainly almost all the deaths, are in the unvaccinated people. The lesson is clear. Vaccination is our way out of this. If you're not vaccinated, you remain vulnerable and susceptible.
And as new guidelines suggest, life can return to normal. But how normal depends on how well vaccinated we are. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
More Ontarians will soon be eligible to book a second vaccine dose earlier. Starting on Saturday, youth aged 12 to 17 who live in Delta variant hotspots can book dose number 2. And on Monday, all adults who received a first dose of an mRNA vaccine, either Pfizer or Moderna, can book their second shot. According to the province, this will accelerate second dose eligibility for about 1.5 million people. In the U.S., one of the most watched murder cases in history is over. Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer convicted of killing George Floyd, has been sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. That's less time than prosecutors had asked for, far more, though, than Chauvin's defense had wanted. Jackson Proskow is outside the courthouse tonight. Jackson, how are people reacting?
Well, Donna, this is one of the stiffest sentences against a police officer for unauthorized use of lethal force on the job. And for the Floyd family and for many of the people here in Minneapolis, it's the beginning of the accountability they've been looking for.
And for the defense. Good afternoon, Your Honor. Eric.
For murdering George Floyd, former police officer Derek Chauvin will spend the next 2 decades of his life in prison.
I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family.
It concludes one of the most watched trials in American history that brought the rare conviction of an on-duty police officer in a case that sparked an international movement for racial justice.
If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
Inside the court, Floyd's family delivered emotional impact statements about the man they lost and about the horror they witnessed.
The sudden murder of George has forever traumatized us. You may see us cry, but the full extent of our pain and trauma will never be seen with the naked eye.
Floyd's family had asked for the maximum possible sentence, while Derek Chauvin's mother broke her long-standing silence to plead for leniency.
When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me.
Chauvin spoke briefly to hint at a future appeal, but offered no apology or remorse before being sentenced.
I want to give my condolences to the Floyd family.
Outside, members of the community expressed anger at the less than maximum sentence, but also relief at seeing accountability.
You know, this is a small victory for, our community right now. I feel like, the sentence could have been a little bigger, but hey, 1 year, I guess, is better than no year.
Chauvin is likely to spend 15 years in prison before becoming eligible for parole. In his brief remarks today, he hinted at a future appeal and suggested more information will come to light that he believes will bring comfort to the Floyd family. Donna?
Jackson Proskow in Minneapolis tonight. Thanks. The Florida condo that crumbled as residents slept. Coming up, still no sign of dozens of people, possibly including Canadians. In Florida, it's now becoming clear many of those who were inside that 12-story condo that partially collapsed are unlikely to be found alive. Global Affairs Canada says they've received reports indicating Canadian citizens may be affected, but they're not offering any more information than that. The search is still underway and it is painstaking. A wing of the condo, all 12 stories, pancaked to the ground. Rescue workers are struggling to safely access the site. They're dealing with small fires and rain. Teams are forming bucket brigades to remove rubble piece by piece. Others are digging from below, looking and listening for any signs of life. A state of emergency has been declared. At least 4 people are known to have died and 160 are unaccounted for.
We know that people can't survive for extended period of times under the rubble. So we're going to keep on going until we're told, time's up.
It is unclear what caused the 40-year-old building to collapse. Scientists have long been concerned about the shifting sands of Miami Beach, especially with rising sea levels. The building had also recently undergone work to its roof. Still ahead, I speak with an expert about the sensitive nature of searching for unmarked graves. Indigenous families know about children who never came home from school, who died far away in what were called residential schools. In most cases, the bodies would not be sent home unless the family paid for it. And so here we are, decades later, finding these unmarked graves, causing families to be traumatized all over again. Finding the graves is hard work, both technically and emotionally. With me is Kisha Supernant. She is director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta. Kisha, this is such sensitive work on so many levels because ground-penetrating radar involves walking over the graves. Can you help us understand the intensive, sensitive nature of the work?
Yes, it is extremely difficult work. So there's, of course, the technical elements of ensuring that we're doing all this work to the highest possible standard. But being out in these places often means hearing the stories of survivors and families, and then starting to get those traces and hints of the possible burial places of these children who never came home. It is very emotionally devastating and difficult work to do as we walk across the graves of these children.
And each community, of course, will make their own decisions about the next steps when graves are found. But can you explain what's involved if they decide to go ahead and identify the remains and give them a proper burial?
I think this is a really big and important question. So the work that we've primarily done has been remote sensing and finding the locations. To take it to the next step involves really a form of forensic investigation, and that can involve exhumation, potentially using techniques such as DNA to try to identify these children and connect them with living relatives. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not. That's quite a time-intensive process if that is the next steps that a community wants to take. And then there's also a call for justice and accountability. And there are forensic approaches which can look at potential signs of any remains that of trauma or things like that. But that itself is a big unknown. We don't know what the state of the remains necessarily are. We don't know how many answers can be found. And I want to emphasize, I think a lot of communities, that might not be a step they're ready or willing to take. It might be enough to know where these locations are, to do the historical research, and then to commemorate and do ceremony around these sacred places. So we'll have to see how communities wish to approach it, but it will be a more forensic investigation should there be more work beyond the kind of ground penetrating radar.
Are there enough people in this country with the expertise and the experience to do this kind of work, even the ground-penetrating radar for all the sites that might exist?
Not in the timelines that I think many communities are hoping for. There just are a small handful of people with experience on the ground-penetrating radar side. There's not that many more that might have capacity on the forensic side. And I think there's a role potentially for private industry to play a role here, especially on the ground penetrating radar, but it has to be done to the highest technical standards. And there are some best practices that we've established. I know there's also been conversations about potentially engaging with internationals or task forces and groups who have done forensic work at the scale that might be required. So I think there's a lot to sort out about how we can actually meet the needs of communities from a capacity standpoint, and hopefully build some of that capacity within communities where appropriate.
What do you think Canadians should expect to hear about this story in the months and years ahead?
Well, I hope that there's a continued attention to these stories as they come out from every residential school in the country. And of course, communities will decide how much they want to make public the information and in which ways. But I think we can expect more Kamloops, more Cowessess, and thousands more graves of children across the lands we call Canada.
Keisha Supernant, Director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We, the North, next. The Habs make it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and some fans lose it. We're all Habs fans now, right? There was jubilation when the Montreal Canadiens scored that overtime goal, beating the Las Vegas Golden Knights and sealing their spot in the Stanley Cup Final. Not only is it the first time the Habs have made it to the final since winning the Cup in 1993, it's the first time any Canadian team has made it this far in a decade, and it happened on Quebec's Fête Nationale holiday. Big crowds gathered outside the Bell Centre, social distancing non-existent. They went wild after that winning goal, and then some fans took things way too far. Over a dozen arrests were made, 8 police vehicles were damaged, 2 officers suffered minor injuries. In the end, police used tear gas to disperse the crowds. Fans are now gearing up for the finals. Who Montreal plays will be decided in tonight's game between the New York Islanders and the Tampa Bay Lightning, and the first game of the final is Monday, June 28th in either Tampa or New York. Something to look forward to, and that is Global National for this Friday. I'm Donna Friesen. Everyone's jumping on the bandwagon now, even the animals. Flambeau is the service dog the team fostered while he was undergoing his training, and there are plenty of pups who are Habs fans. A few cats, too. There should be cats, of course. I think. I'm a cat fan. Thanks for watching. Robin Gill will be here at the Anchor Desk this weekend. I'll see you again on Monday. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.